We good to go?
It smells good. Oh, that's just pecan. Yeah, we're good to go. We have the 12. Okay.
A quorum being present, the committee will come to order. Today we are meeting to consider H.R. 2200, the Transportation Security Administration Authorization Act. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement. And before I do that, I'd like to indicate that we will have votes somewhere between 10:15, 10:30, about 5 votes. We plan to recess and come back shortly after, but we'll proceed until that point. The Transportation Security Administration Authorization Act is the first authorization bill that the committee has produced for the Department of Homeland Security this year. It is also the first authorization bill produced for TSA since it was established in 2001. It is the product of months of extensive bipartisan discussion and reflect input from members, GAO, the Inspector General, and transportation stakeholders from across the spectrum. This comprehensive security bill not only helps to guide the efforts of the men and women who work to secure our skies, rail lines, and roads every day, but also does a great deal to protect the people that rely on these transportation systems. For these reasons, I am pleased to report that H.R. 2200, as amended, was approved unanimously in subcommittee last week. I want to thank the chairwoman and ranking members of the Transportation Security and Infrastructure Protection Subcommittee, Ms. Jackson Lee and Mr. Dent, for working in a bipartisan way to produce solid security legislation that has so much support. I look forward to seeing the same spirit of bipartisanship in action today. Recognizing that we have a lot to get to in a short amount of time today, I will conclude my remarks. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. King, to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me very seriously thank you and your staff for working in such a bipartisan way on this bill. I want to commend Chairwoman Jackson Lee and also Ranking Member Dent for the bipartisan effort they put into this and for coming up with a bill which is solid and I think addresses many, many key issues. Now, this is the first authorization bill for the TSA since the agency was created in 2001. It was moved to the Department of Homeland Security in 2003 and has approximately 50,000 employees. And while authorizing TSA is important, it is certainly our hope on this side that the committee will move a comprehensive authorization bill for all of DHS and the bill be passed prior to the House consideration of the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill so it can have significant impact. Mr. Chairman, there are a number of key issues addressed here today, and a number of Republican amendments will be offered and I hope adopted. We believe will strengthen the security of transportation and help workers across the country. But there are some concerns in that there were a number of amendments that could have been considered but were not considered because of the concern of jurisdiction, of it going to other committees and the process being delayed. And I understand at this juncture why the majority would take that position. We don't want it bogged down with other committees, but it also shows the inherent flaw we have where so many committees and subcommittees have jurisdiction in the area of Homeland Security. We saw Secretary Napolitano yesterday said as far as she's concerned, it should be this committee, which is the sole authorizing committee for Homeland Security. So again, the problems we encountered in coming up with this legislation are just going to be repeated again and again until we refine and streamline the committee system and give primary and clear jurisdiction to the Homeland Security Committee. Also, other concerns we have, Mr. Chairman, I think you share these concerns because you mentioned it yesterday with Secretary Napolitano, is that the Department of Homeland Security was not at all engaged in this bill. Neither TSA nor DHS headquarters provided any input whatsoever. And yet here we are moving a key bill, the first authorization bill for TSA since its inception 8 years ago, and we're getting no input whatsoever from TSA. And there is no political leadership at TSA. And so I have real concerns, Mr. Chairman, about bringing this to the floor and having a full House vote without the department having any input whatsoever. So I would ask that we consider that after the bill is approved, and I assume it will be, and I hope it is approved today, though, that we not move hastily toward fuller action until we have an opportunity to meet with the department. And I'm saying that obviously as a Republican, not a member of the Democratic administration, but I just feel whether it's Republican or Democratic administration, this issue is so important that the administration should have input before we go forward as far as having a full House vote. So with that, Mr. Chairman, again, in the interest of time, I know everyone is hanging on every eloquent word of mine, including my friend Mr. Pasquale down here. But unlike Bill Pasquale, yes, sir, I will finish before my time is up. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, we're glad to see that Mr. Pasquale has bipartisan support on this committee. I now recognize the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Security, and Infrastructure Protection, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, to make an opening statement.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to the ranking member. I think there is great eloquence in this committee in a bipartisan manner. We hang on to each other's words with great passion. I think our chairperson, Chairman Thompson, is right and correct. This is the right thing to do. This is the right time to do it. And that is, of course, to address the question of transportation security. I'd like to thank my ranking member for working on what has come to be a bipartisan legislative initiative, and Mr. Dent was very much a part of its deliberation, and I thank him for his constructive criticism and constructive, if you will, input. As I indicated, the leadership of the chairman is appreciated on this issue, because I would ask the question to my colleagues, if not now, then when? We have the responsibility to secure the nation's highways and byways and transit systems, and we have the responsibility to do it now. I'm proud of H.R. 2200, which we unanimously passed out of my subcommittee last week. As I look at my colleague and friend from Texas, Mr. Olson, I make note of the fact that we've agreed to look at his issues as we go forward. It is a result of a thorough, bipartisan, and transparent process, and I appreciate the leadership, as I indicated, of the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent, again, for his work in steering this important legislation through the committee. I do know that we do not have the political leadership throughout the entire Department of Homeland Security, but I remind those who were here, and I was, and if you were not, after 9/11, we did not have a Department of Homeland Security, but we worked very hard to respond to the nation's outcry. We have a Homeland Security Department. We may not have all of the principles, but we have the issues. This legislation addresses the issues. I know that this bill has been made better by the true cooperation that has gone into it. In that spirit, I'm looking forward to today's markup and the swift passing of the Transportation Security Administration Authorization Act out of the committee. The people of America wait on us. The commitment of this committee to provide security to transit mobility systems is now at hand. And I ask my colleagues that we work together. Mr. Chairman, I thank you so very much for your time and your leadership and the smiling face of Mr. Pasquale. I yield back.
Well, it must be the Pasquale morning. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Security, and Infrastructure Protection, Mr. Dent, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chair Sheila Jackson Lee, too, for all that she's done to help move this process forward. She's been very gracious and very helpful. She's asked for our input from the beginning and included Republican representation in a variety of stakeholder meetings. These meetings included representatives from industry groups, business coalitions, union representatives, and various subject matter experts. So again, I want to really thank her for that. And while we did not agree on all aspects of the legislation, I think the unanimous manner in which this bill left subcommittee clearly demonstrated that you have engaged in a truly collaborative effort. I think that bodes very well for the future of our subcommittee, and I was pleased to be able to co-sponsor this legislation. Having said all that, let me associate myself with remarks of the ranking member, Mr. King, especially those expressing an overall concern about the lack of participation by TSA. I can appreciate the majority's desire to move this bipartisan legislation forward in a very quick manner. Obviously, our subcommittee considered this bill last week. Today, the full committee is considering the legislation. My understanding is the majority plans to move this legislation on the floor next week. But my underlying concern remains we're moving this legislation forward to the floor without any substantive TSA input, without a senior political appointee, an assistant secretary for TSA. The administration is very much like a ship without a captain. And I urge caution as the committee moves this legislation forward. Given the circumstances under which this legislation was crafted, this is a good bill. And I look forward to adopting some very constructive amendments here today. I'd also like to thank Chairwoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, too, for her commitment to holding a hearing on the large aircraft security program. That's an issue very near and dear to the hearts of many members on both sides of the aisle of this committee. I know Mr. Olson in particular is very concerned about it. I'm concerned about it very much. And I think we can learn a great deal on that issue if we bring all the stakeholders in the room and make sure that we adopt rules that are risk-based. And I appreciate her willingness to have that hearing. And I have no comments about Congressman Pascrell at this time, so I will yield back the balance of my time.
Hearing no opposition to Mr. Pasquale, we'll move forward. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, asked to engage in a brief colloquy.
Gentleman is recognized for the stated purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You and I have had a number of discussions, and there have been discussions at the staff level, and I appreciate the attention of Chair Sheila Jackson-Lee to this issue with the proposal of a hearing. But the large aircraft security program, at least as initially proposed, would impose impractical security measures on general aviation operators and airports. And certainly our committee is devoted to enhancing the security of our nation, but there are legitimate concerns that have been raised about the proposed rule. I hope that the TSA will work closely, if they're listening, those who are there, with the general aviation industry in developing reasonable security policies and procedures that strike the appropriate balance between security, the movement of goods and commerce, and general aviation. I know that you, on behalf of the committee, have expressed the same concerns to the TSA.
The gentleman is correct. I've advised TSA over the committee's concern in letters to both TSA Acting Administrator and the Manager of TSA Office of General Aviation. I stated that a number of the proposed LSAP requirements in the NPRM appear to be problematic to the general aviation community and may not be the most effective means of securing these type of aircraft. In response to concerns raised by this committee and several individual members of Congress, TSA is currently talking with representatives from general aviation industry in an effort to address outstanding LSAP issues. I am hopeful that TSA will engage in a meaningful way to find sensible solutions that will enhance general aviation security, yet reflect the necessary flexibility and mobility needed of this diverse and important segment of our national transportation system. I also understand that the chairwoman and ranking member of the Transportation Security and Infrastructure Subcommittee agreed last week to convene a hearing on general aviation security in the coming months to shine a bright light on this important issue.
Well, I thank the chair, and I certainly share your sentiments and hope that the industry discussions with TSA will result in an improved proposal. But obviously, I believe our committee should continue to oversee the process. I appreciate Chair Jackson-Lee's interest in the matter, and that we would reserve the committee's full jurisdictional prerogatives to address these issues if TSA fails to responsibly seek a result that meets the needs and the concerns expressed by you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee. I look forward to continuing to work with you on the issue.
Would the gentleman yield?
It's
Yes, gentlemen, it's a colloquy, but in the interest of moving on, Mr. Brown.
Well, I appreciate the time, and I appreciate Mr. DeFazio bringing this up. As a general aviation pilot, I just want to remind this committee and TSA that General aviation is not a group of folks who just like to fly around and poke holes in the clouds. It's actually critical for the commerce in that people who fly in general aviation, particularly general business aviation, are absolutely critical for our economic well-being. So I hope the committee, subcommittee, will certainly take general aviation and their interest at heart, and will look very strongly to the various individuals, whether it's the AOPA or the general business community, aviation community, and get their input so that we can continue to have a robust general aviation community without all the encumbrances that can be placed on it. And I thank the chairman for yielding.
I'll yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Harmon, who is next. But I can assure the committee, agreement has already been reached with our chairwoman and ranking member on this very subject. And we will include all the stakeholders going forward, just like we've done in the past. Ms. Harmon.
I just wanted to commend you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. DeFazio and others who are interested in the subject, and to remind us that one of the warnings the prior Secretary of Homeland Security gave us, Michael Chertoff, was that small boats and general aviation could be used to transport dirty bombs into the United States. And so it does matter that we pay attention to both. I raised the subject of small boats yesterday with Secretary Napolitano, and she will be looking at that. And so I think we need to take the equities into account of all the stakeholders. General aviation is a critical industry for the United States, but it would be devastating for the United States if we had a dirty bomb attack here. And I yield back.
Ms. Sanchez from California.
Yes, I would just like to associate myself with Mr. DeFazio's comments representing John Wayne Airport, the largest general aviation airport in the nation. There is a lot of commerce, and there's a lot of need for this general aviation to occur. So I'm very happy that Mr. DeFazio brought the subject up and that we'll be taking a look at it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman of Subcommittee, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the colloquy that you had with Mr. DeFazio. And just yesterday, I spent minimally an hour with representatives of general aviation. But, Mr. Chairman, I want to remind you that we were looking at this even in the last Congress, and we had briefings. I know we raised the issue about perimeter security, but I know that there has to be a balance as relates to commerce. So the final point I want to leave is our door is open. We want general aviation representatives to continue to come to us as we prepare for our hearing, and we want to make sure that we are both securing and respecting of the valuable contributions that general aviation make to the transit system. I yield back.
Mr. Cuellar.
Mr. Chairman, I also want to associate myself with the words of Mr. DeFazio and also Mr. Brown. I own an airplane also myself, and there's a lot of folks in my district, the International Bank of Commerce and other folks that are very interested on this. We have to find a balance. I think Ms. Harmon is correct, but you know, I certainly look forward working with my fellow chairperson here to find that balance. But we do need to have a little bit reasonable approach than some of the things we're seeing from TSA.
Thank you. And I want to assure the gentleman from Oregon that the committee will work closely to monitor the LSAP process and provide the appropriate oversight to ensure the regulations TSA issue are fair, reasonable, and enhance general aviation security. I also want to assure the other members of the committee who have an interest in this issue, and their input will be vital as we continue to conduct oversight over the LASP process. In the interest of moving along in consideration of the bill, I'd like to remind the committee that other members may submit opening statements for the record. Mr. Olson, I know of your interest in this issue, and you have an amendment a little bit later on we'll talk a little bit about. I now call up H.R. 2200. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Per my agreement with the ranking member, the committee will use a roster for amendments during consideration of the measure.
Mr. Chairman, reserving the right to object, I will not object. I'd ask the chair to explain our agreement concerning amendments.
The committee will take up amendments in the order listed on the amendment roster. If a member is not present to offer an amendment that is listed on the roster, the chair will allow the member to offer the amendment when the member returns, to the extent practicable and not prohibited by House committee rules. Finally, amendments that are not on the roster may be considered after there has been an opportunity for amendments on the roster to be offered, to the extent practicable and not prohibited by House or committee rules.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read. The clerk will designate Section 1.
Section 1, short title, table of contents.
I have and offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was circulated in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2200, offered by Mr. Thompson, Mississippi. Strike all after the enacting clause.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as original text for the purpose of amendment. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. My amendment in the nature of a substitute is the result of a bipartisan effort to make TSA the best organization it can be. I thank my colleagues from both sides of the aisle for their insight and support to make it possible. Each of these provisions was developed in a bipartisan fashion. Section 101 authorizes over $15.6 billion in appropriations for Transportation Security Administration activities and programs for fiscal year 2010 and 11, and includes provisions on a range of security issues. The amount authorized in H.R. 2200 does not include funds collected by TSA through its fee authority. Section 201 focuses TSA on fulfilling the 100% air cargo screening mandate for domestic flights by 2010 by directing TSA to establish a system to verify screening of all air cargo shipped by air from a foreign airport. TSA's testimony in March convinced the committee that it needed to focus resources on screening domestic cargo in order to meet the August 2010 deadline. Section 211 requires all flight attendants to complete 5 hours of TSA-administered self-defense training within a 2-year period. It also requires TSA to establish an oversight program for the basic security training. Section 212 directs TSA to submit a plan to Congress on how to improve security screening procedures for individuals with metal implants. Section 227 requires GAO to submit semi-annual reports to Congress on TSA's expenditures on inline systems for checked baggage, as well as TSA's progress in the nationwide deployment of such screening systems. Section 236 furthers the committee's efforts to ensure the proper training of frontline workers. This section directs TSA to develop a plan for establishing security training for pilots that work in the all-cargo environment. Again, I thank you for the bipartisan, transparent nature in which these provisions were developed. I appreciate your attention to this amendment, and I encourage its bipartisan adoption.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member.
Chairman, if I could just speak for several moments on this, I certainly intend to vote for it. I just want to, and I again want to applaud the bipartisan nature of the amendment and the nature of a substitute. One concern I do have is the provision regarding the training for flight attendants. I believe this training is important. I have a very good working relationship, I believe, with flight attendants. I'm not certain, as I read the legislation, that we have a full idea of what it's going to cost, who will be responsible for those costs, and I, again, have that concern of unintended consequences. So, obviously, I do intend to vote for this. I know especially Mrs. Miller is a strong advocate of this, but I just ask that we keep that in mind as the legislation goes forward, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. We have now, I believe, have 5 votes on the floor. Young lady from Texas, you have a...
I was going to speak on the manager's amendment.
Oh, young lady from Texas.
Yeah, Let me thank the chairman very much. This strikes a very effective approach to some of the, I'd like to call them ailments or ills that we have been trying to address as it relates to surface transportation and aviation transportation. I'd like to particularly note that we have responded to the needs of extra training for individuals who are in flight. That is very important, that everyone face that issue. We have expanded the opportunity for dedicated canines for aviation, and we've tried to put life to assess again the registered traveler program, which frankly has had its ups and downs, but has merit. And I think we have put this in a very constructive manner. I'd also like to say that we have added a pilot program we believe can be very helpful on testing some of the issues that we have concern with our airports. This manager's amendment attempts to address the questions of research and technology, again, labor and training issues, and as well, it responds to the question of dedicated canines. So let me make note of a conversation that I had with Mr. Rogers, and I look forward to his amendment that is coming subsequently, and wanted to acknowledge that the approach that we've taken to his particular issue was to create more flexibility and to give us the opportunity to build on what has been his cause, which I think is very important, the increase in the use of dedicated canines. In fact, Mr. Rogers, I just want you to note that in my travels to different airports, in surveying how they do security, I have had people on the ground say, give us canines. And so your message is going forward, and we are taking that message, and you'll find that in the manager's amendment. Mr. Chairman, I think that this is a very effective way of moving forward on this legislation, and I rise to support the manager's amendment. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, I know we're pressed for time, but I want to thank the chairman for adding the language regarding federal flight deck officers to allow them to use contract training facilities and FAM's field office facilities for training purposes, the increased administrative support they'll receive, and then in particular the fact that we're going to allow them to be reimbursed for the expenses they incur in participating in the voluntary program for periodic training and recertification. Mr. Chairman, these are fabulous volunteers. They're the last line of defense in our aircraft. You know, they're giving of their own time and their own resources, and this is at least some small recognition of the service they're providing to the security of our nation and our skies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We have 5 votes scheduled. One is a recommit, so it will probably be about an hour. The committee will stand in recess to allow members to vote on the floor.
Well, everybody love you. Yeah, you know, you don't.